Hey, welcome everybody. You're listening to Pastured Poultry Talk. This is episode 106. I'm your host, Mike Badger. And today we're going to continue our introduction to Pastured Poultry series and talk about feeds. Now, I got to be honest with you. This is the third attempt at recording this podcast I'm going to make. The first two, I wasn't really satisfied with them. And this is amidst just being busier than, I don't know what, like a leprechaun on St. Patrick's Day. I don't know what it is. You know, the phone's been ringing. The emails have been flowing. Life has been happening. We've been quarantined and suppressed by our government. Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't say it like that, should I? We've been quarantined for our own good. Wink, wink. And, I'm sure like most of you, it's just been busy. So we're going to continue this. I'm going to catch it up. We're going to buckle down and just plow right through this. And in the episode, I want to talk about feeding. I want to lay out kind of some practical things that you need to know and think about when you're feeding. Like, this is a big subject. Part of the problem was the second time I recorded this, I had probably an hour and a half of material and it just kind of went all over the place. And I'm like, nobody's going to listen to this and actually be able to wrap their head around what I'm saying. So the essence of what I want to do and convey in this episode, and something that's manageable, is just give you some actionable, intelligent insights to feeding your pastured poultry, coming from the perspective that you might have not ever fed a chicken before. And I don't want you to go out searching the internet and next thing you know, you're trying to kill your chickens with fermented feed because it's moldy or something like that. Or you're not giving your chickens any feed and you're just trying to let them live off pasture. So we don't want to get there. I want to distill all the practical knowledge that I've come to gain personally, all the wisdom that I've been able to collect from my friend Jeff Maddox, his teachings will weigh heavily in this episode, and all the benefit of the greater successfully, profitably, and long term. So I'm not going to give you the fly by night, the greatest, latest crazes here. I'm going to kind of focus in on the things that are tried and true. If you want to branch out and do things differently, that's fine. I have I may jest a little bit. I have no real philosophical differences with trying different things and feeding different ways and trying innovative ways to get nutrition into your flock. But what I am most caring about is giving you information that is tried, true, and get you off to a good first couple flocks, get you success. Because there's nothing worse than following bad feed advice and then having your first 50, 100, 200 chickens just go so terribly poorly that it taints the rest of your life, or at least gets you off to a bad experience. I don't want to be too dramatic. Maybe I do. Maybe I'm in a dramatic mood today. Who knows? But before we get into all of that, let me just give a shout out to Premier One. Premier One is a sponsor of the podcast. I really like working with Premier One. I have their fencing. I just bought some new ones. I'm using Premier One for my layers. That's what I do with them. They are stuck to an area in the fencing so I can control exactly where they're at for the most part, and let them work. First phase this spring was a garden area. They worked some compost into the ground. Second phase is a hillside that had some cover crop down and some chicken brooder bedding spread on it. So they've been scratching that in. So they've been working, and I've been using my portable fencing from Premier to make the chickens do that work. So this really speaks to the benefit of Premier poultry netting, because it's lightweight, it's easy to move, and it really does a good job of deterring ground predators when it's properly energized. It literally can protect your bottom line by keeping your flock safer. And Premier also supplies a variety of those energizers to help meet your needs depending on what you need to do and what you want to do. If you're looking for fences that work from the people that use them every day, please contact Premier at 800-282-6631 or just visit pasturepoultrytalk.com/premier to request an informational catalog and tell them Mike Badger at Pastured Poultry Talk sent you. I'd like to also give a shout out to Winnie Meadows Hatchery down there in north central Texas. Winnie Meadows supplies pastured poultry farmers with day-old broiler chicks from their family-owned hatchery in northeast Texas. Man, I've been friends with the Hales. Daniel Hale, in this case, operates the hatchery for a long time. It seems like not quite all of my pastured poultry career, but a big chunk of it. And I first encountered the hatchery here when I wrote a story about Daniel and what they were doing on farm several years ago. That hatchery sprung from an itch that they had as a farm to get reliable chicks on their farm on a regular basis because they were having delivery problems. They were having logistics problems. And their answer was to hatch those eggs themselves. So they've been doing that, and they have since branched out and been able to provide day-old broiler chicks, meat birds, the little white meatballs, Cornish cross, to their farm and neighboring farms, and actually branching out and shipping across the country. Windy Meadows Hatchery just brings a family scale and just that family touch, a bit of personalization to the day-old broiler chicks. And it's absolutely awesome that you can call and talk directly to the person who's hatching and packing your chicks. So if you're in need of those day-old broiler chicks at a very competitive price, I recommend you reach out to Windy Meadows Hatchery. And just don't wait till the last minute. This is not a good time of the year, not a good season, not a good environment, not a good climate to be waiting to the last minute to order your chicks. Plan ahead a little bit. Expect a couple week lead time at least because of the COVID-19. So go ahead and just reach out to pasturepoultrytalk.com/WMH and tell them Mike Badger at Pasture Poultry Talk sent you. Let's bust into some feeding your pasture poultry flock. This is probably one of the most critical things that you're going to do with your flock. And let me just talk first about cheap feed. And this is going to be kind of our first principle. And we're going to go through 9 practical steps at least. I might have a 10th one in there. I don't really like even numbers. So we're going to try to keep it odd. The first advice we have for feeding is this is one of the most important foundations of your pasture poultry flock. You skimp on this at your own detriment. Now, I know that's easy to say, but when you're writing checks to the feed store, to the feed person, and you see all that money going out before you ever see any coming back in, it's hard. It's a hard thing to really wrap your head around. The problem is you can't judge the performance of your feed until you use it in your chickens. And so the danger is that you buy chicken feed that is based solely on price. You find the cheapest feed that you possibly can. And a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times in the data that I see, you pay for that feed on the back end in terms of poor performance. In other words, and I did this, I not personally, but I've published some feed trials in the Apogrit versus a cheap feed, as cheap as you can make it, with ingredients that change all the time to make sure it stays cheap, and a formulated ration that never changes and it was always the same quality, which costs more. You can guess there's a price point, right? There's a cheap and there's a not cheap. The data that typically plays out here is that the feed that is not cheap has better feed conversion and has better carcass yield and better results. So you get a bigger chicken with less feed coming out the end of your flock than you do using the cheap feed that saves you some money on the front end. And unless you're tracking numbers, unless you're trialing those feeds on your own farm, you don't really see that, right? That's not something that's in your mind when you do it. So know that from the beginning. Don't shop on price. Shop on the best feed that you can possibly get and afford and make money at. And if you're gonna wrestle on price, you got to trial it. You got to raise both those batches simultaneously using the same protocols, and then measure everything and make your decision after that point. So won't harp too much more on the cheap feed. Just know it. So second point here is understanding Pasture's role in feeding your birds. Now, this admittedly is not as big of an issue today. There's a couple waves in the community, some non-farmer folks who are pushing this narrative that chickens can live on pasture alone, or at least without grain, and that's caused some secondary problems. So we need to talk about it. A couple of years ago, 5-10 years ago, it was pretty common misconception that new people coming into pasture poultry would believe that the chicken was pasture raised, so it didn't need to be fed a purchased grain or purchased feed. That's simply not true. That's not the biology of the chicken. The chicken is a monogastric animal. It has it can't get the nutrition from green stuff that a cow or some kind of herbivore can. So just know that if you're raising pasture poultry, the pasture's role in your production is, first of all, it's like a blank canvas. When you put birds out on a fresh piece of pasture, it's clean. And the birds, of course, will pick through it. They'll pick out some grasses, they'll pick out some clovers, whatever. They'll pick out some grain, some insects, and they'll forage on all that stuff and consume it. And they'll also manure. And so now you've given the chickens that clean canvas that they've made dirty. And so the part of the rotational model of pasture poultry is to move away from that dirty canvas into a fresh, clean canvas, which is the rotational model of pasture poultry. It is the foundation of pasture poultry. You can't raise pasture poultry without some kind of rotational model that puts the birds actually living on pasture. Like that's the core. We've talked about that before. And so that's Pasture's role, is that health of the chicken. And your chickens will reciprocate a benefit back to the pasture in the terms of fertility. And the nutrition that the chickens get from being on pasture, first of all, they get the vitamin D from the sunlight. They will get various omega-3 fatty acids from eating on the green stuff and foraging on that, and foraging on the animal proteins and via insects and worms and things they find. So they do forage, they do eat stuff out of that pasture. But when you think about foraging, it really is an all-encompassing thing. It's not a chicken sitting there grazing down a stand of clover, right? They'll munch it, they'll love it, they'll eat it, but they still need that prepared ration because they can't get what they need from the pasture alone. So just don't be fooled in that. And to illustrate this, early on in my processing days, we ran into people who raised Cornish cross, of all things, to 7-8 weeks without feed, or very, very minimal feed. And if you ever raised a Cornish cross, you know that they're hungry all the time. They like to eat. That's part of what makes them special, quote unquote. When you see somebody who tries to raise these birds like that, what you end up with is like a 2.5 pound chicken live at 7 or 8 weeks, or maybe 3 pounds if you're really, really lucky. And the birds just aren't healthy. It's not a good eating experience. There's nothing enjoyable to eat on that chicken. And the birds are always hungry. It's not a high welfare environment, and you shouldn't do it. And I don't care what doctors who write books say, you just shouldn't do it. It's not the way the chicken is designed. Now, there are people who are working on alternative feeding protocols and using alternative ingredients. We're just not there as a scalable solution to anything yet. When that data starts to come in and people actually start proving a model that's replicatable and profitable, then you'll see adoption in that. Otherwise, right now, the way that I'm going to outline feeding your chickens is the way you should look at first. This was really driven home to me a couple years ago when I was in Cameroon. I was in Boya, Cameroon, doing some chicken workshops with a local poultry co-op there. They had a really great group of growers, and listened to some presentations from some of their country poultry folks who was really at that point have bought into the CAFO model of production, right? They were bought into it hook, line, and sinker. And I remember listening to a presentation where they were poo-pooing the idea of free-range chickens. And just give you some ideas of some of the dangers you can get into when you go around in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, and you start using terms is understanding what those terms may mean to somebody. So in Cameroon, a free-range chicken is what I would normally consider a feral chicken, which is a chicken that just runs the village and eats scraps and whatever, there's nobody really taking care of it. There's nobody giving it water. There's nobody feeding it. That's just out there foraging for whatever it can live off of and procreating. And in a free range chicken in Cameroon lays about 20 eggs a year. So that's roughly 2 clutches of eggs that it hatches, right? That's what free ranging for everything that it can eat supports. And the chickens themselves are, like 3.5 pound type of hens, right? Live. So very, very small. Definitely not a business model there. But it's illustrative of what happens when you just turn a chicken out to make it fend for itself, which is the feeding model that some people advocate for. So if you're going to feed, buy feed, spend money on feed, then what are some tips? And that's where we'll go next. So tips for sourcing feed. Really, there's just a couple, I think, for me that I have really come to believe in. One is you should buy from a local independent mill first. Pastured Poultry, by and large, is a local independent, community-based farming system. And you should try to support the folks that are in your neighborhood, in your community, in your region before you go out and bring stuff in from the outside. And oftentimes that's buying a local grain or buying from a local mill or even your local feed store if they're not milling it, but just getting there locally. And I think that's important because it establishes a relationship with another piece of your supply chain. You can ask questions, you can make special requests, you can have dialogues, and it's a much more fruitful conversation than it is walking into a Tractor Supply, for example, which is around, I don't know if they're national or not, but the farm supply, the national brand farm supply store where you walk in and they've got shelves stocked with, all the feeds that you see on commercials. And, if that's all you have, that's what you have to work with, right? So you make the most of it, but there's not really setting you up to have a good relationship in your supply chain. Like, you're so far removed from that feeds manufacturing and the people who are helping you when you walk in those doors. You might find some people who can help you. You might not. You'll get the information that the feed manufacturers provide back through their retail channels to help sell their product, and you won't get necessarily the best information you need. And that's not a slight to that model. It's efficient in the way that our broader food system has proven to be efficient, but whether or not it's resilient, whether or not it's the best thing for you, just like the Pastured Poultry direct to retail model, it's not quite as efficient, but it's more resilient and it's much healthier in all the aspects for the community. So buy it locally if you can. And as I mentioned at the top, buy the best feed that you possibly can. So whether that's organic or whether that's the non-GMO, the conventional, the soy-free, the corn-free, whatever kind of feed you're looking for, there's a chance you got a local mill somewhere that can get it for you. So just go out there and look and see what you have. That was a homework assignment in one of the other, if you downloaded the worksheets from some of the previous episodes, you saw those prompts to go and collect information about what feeds you had available near you so you could get prices and just kind of understand and make some calls, get a sense of the landscape where you're at. Because when you go out there shopping for feed, you're going to run into all kinds of craziness and it's going to make your head spin. Because if you've never done this before, this is like buying eggs in the grocery store. There's going to be a claim for everything and you're not going to really necessarily always know exactly what you should be buying. So real quick, run through some of the types of feed that you're going to find, and we'll focus on the certification or the grain type first, and then we'll make a short detour into the ingredient specific stuff because it all comes to play. You're going to have three broad choices to make when you buy feed. One is going to be you're going to buy a certified organic. One is going to be you buy a non-organic, no claim made, just kind of run of the mill, the cheapest feed you're going to find pretty much, right? The conventional stuff expected to be GMO. And then you're going to find something in the middle, which is often the non-GMO claims. And some of it's accredited through a certifier, and some of it is just word of mouth or trust from the miller or the farmer you're buying it from. And so on the two extremes, they're the easiest to deal with because they're probably the most known, right? They're the best known quantities. So you have the conventional feed. Like I said, it's going to be probably soybean meal as the protein source and corn as the protein or the energy source. and then some minerals and vitamins mixed in there. And you're going to find wheat midds and other kind of byproducts to fill out the ration, which don't really provide anything really. Those feeds are typically GMO. That's what you should expect. And they're going to be farmed with, however GMO crops are farmed with, synthetic pesticides, herbicides, Roundup, of course, that'll be a part of it. And the one thing I would say here in a lot of times the soybean meal is hexane extracted. So it's solvent extracted soybean meal, which means they're using a chemical, hexane in this case, to separate the fat from the protein, and the fat is used in something else, right? It's a separate product. The meal that's left over is formed into a high protein meal that is used in chicken feeds. So not really my most enjoyable thought process here. I usually go to the other extreme and prefer to purchase certified organic feed, which I have a couple of those suppliers locally that I can choose from. It's about twice the amount of money, almost to the penny. So where I can buy the conventional stuff, broiler feed, for example, for, maybe 20-ish cents, 18 to 20 cents a pound, my certified organic options are in the neighborhood of 40 to 42 cents a pound. So quite a bit difference. I think they both perform relatively well, but I do prefer the certified organic because of the way that it's raised. It's non-GMO and it's not used with the synthetic pesticides. It's not a solvent extracted soybean meal. A lot of times, the one feed I use is a roasted soybean, and the organic stuff, which is the whole bean, is just cracked, right, separated into some chunks, and so it's the bean as it comes off the plant, and it's roasted and processed by cracking it. And then the other one is using some soybean meal, which is still cheaper than the roasted soybean. So there's some trade-offs there. Don't get too crazy in those weeds. The problem, I think, the caution that you need to use is when you're shopping that middle ground, which is non-GMO. There's some non-GMO feed that is, like I said, accredited, and it's usually non-GMO project verified. And they verify the integrity of the grains that make up the feed. And a lot of times these feed manufacturers will actually do pesticide and herbicide residual panels and post that information and use it in their marketing. It's a compromise, really, is what it is from the certified organic feed. And I think a large part of the success has been driven by the marketing that non-GMO project has done, because certified organic has everything to offer that the non-GMO does, except the non-GMO is not certified organic. So it's, if you're looking at the steps, not certified organic is at the top, non-GMO certified is somewhere in the middle. It's not the same. Just the only guarantee it has is it's not using GMO grains. And when you buy the stuff that's not certified or not audited, not accredited by a certifier, then it's really buyer beware. You may be buying transitional grains that are non-GMO, that are marketed as non-GMO. You may be buying non-GMO grains that are farmed like it's 1980. So they still use glyphosate and Roundup and whatever other pesticides that work. Just where they're applied is different. You got to really understand what your goal is when you buy those. And if it's just being able to market the non-GMO grain at a cheaper price point, then yeah, fine. That's probably a good choice. But I think there's a lot of integrity issues that haven't caught up with the Pastured Poultry growers yet by searching and using those grains. It's fine. It's out there. It is a part of the landscape that we have. And I've been burned by this. The story that this brings to mind is when I started raising Pastured Poultry, I realized that there was and is a mill near me that does non-GMO grains. That was what everybody told me. Great price on feed, non-GMO grains. And the reality is the farmer who ran the mill, did plant non-GMO grains, corn and soybeans, the basis of his feeds. And that corn, of course, went into his ration. And he never really made any attempts at clarifying the position. And so you go around telling everybody that he does non-GMO, that the rumor spreads, he lets it spread. Then you find out that he uses soybean meal that he buys from the farmer exchange in town, the feed store in town. He buys the soybean meal to come back and put it in his custom poultry ration. And you know darn well that stuff that he's buying is not non-GMO. It's just conventional stuff. But that feed ingredient was a compromise that he made because he was trying to get price down to honor a longtime customer who was complaining about price, who wanted a cheaper feed. So what happens to the non-GMO soybeans he raises? Well, they get put in the pig ration. And if you order chicken feed with a roasted bean, then you get the non-GMO soybean. So that's the kind of pitfalls that are out there when you start buying and wheeling and dealing and marketing an untrusted, non-verified, non-GMO source. It's the Wild West. You should beware when you do it. I'd recommend you declare a big, either go low or go to the end, stay out of the middle. And it usually works for just about everything you do. You're either the cheap or you're not the cheap. When you try to walk the line and be a little bit less than not the cheapest, then you run into issues. I mentioned the soy in there. Some people more and more these days are reacting to the soy in the feeds. Consumers want it, and that demand is being driven back through the supply chain, through the farmers and through the feed mills. You can find a feed that is made without soy. You can find corn-free options. You can find wheat-free options. And if you need special feeds like that, then you're almost guaranteed going to be searching out a unique custom option from a local mill. And the options for what you can buy is going to be radically smaller than if you buy a corn-based, soy-based ration, because corn and soy are the cheapest energy and protein sources available for the most part. I mean, some parts of the country may vary a little bit, but as a blanket statement, that's pretty much the soy is a really great protein for chickens, it turns out, and it's cost effective, and that's why it's used like it is. There's different types of feed out there based on what's in the feed. The next type of decision you need to make when you look at feed is the nutritional component of the feed. And here's the next tip: feed your chickens based on the age and stage of that chicken. So a young broiler will get fed differently than an old broiler. Day-old pullet will get fed differently than a 16-week-old laying hen. And even a 32 or a 50-week laying hen could be fed differently than a 22-week-old laying hen. And how much you're able to customize that depends on how big your flock size is, how much you care, and how much access to different feeds you have. So we're not going to go crazy in the weeds. I'm going to put together a cheat sheet that lists the basic feed guidelines for broilers, layers, and turkeys, and give you a couple of the options here. And it'll be heavily excerpted from any one of Jeff Maddox's presentations, and just give you an idea of what's possible. But I'm not going to go through all the options because it gets wickedly confusing just to listen to me talk to it, and it's not necessarily the point. The takeaway here is the feed based on the type of chicken that you have, and feed it based on its age. And so I will talk through some generalities. For broilers, one of the safest ways you can feed a broiler is to give it a starter grower ration, which is roughly a 19% protein source, and feed that from day 1 through slaughter. Slaughter being 7 or 8 weeks, 49, 56 days. You really shouldn't be keeping Cornish cross much longer than 56 days unless you're very specifically minded and looking for something very big and you're capable of raising that chicken to that age in a healthy way. But regardless, the 19 and Joel Salatin popularized this feed in his Pastured Poultry Profits book. So it's a standard for trail ration. And what it does is it allows those high performance Cornish cross to start out slower. And by starting out slower, their frame has an opportunity to develop, their organs develop before they put on a lot of weight. And then as they go into the middle of their life and into the market stage, towards slaughter, then they accelerate. They catch back up on that growth curve. And it's a really great way to raise Cornish cross. I recommend if you're maiming your Cornish cross with bad feed management, switch to a starter grower from day one till slaughter. And this works pretty well for the Freedom Rangers too. Probably a little bit less ideal for something like a Freedom Ranger. Your heritage birds have a higher protein requirement. They're going to want to be up there around 24 for starting. Now, the other way to do your meat birds is to offer 2 pounds of starter per chick. So whether that takes 2 weeks or 3 weeks to get through it, offer them 2 pounds, budget 2 pounds per chick. And that starter is going to be somewhere in the 21% range, give or take a few, depending on the exact formulation that you use. And then using this, if you're assuming you're going to start with layers day old at a small number, less than 100, probably, maybe even less than 500 is a relatively small number. You're not going to get too many custom formulations for like a couple hundred layers. But anyway, so an easy way to feed layers from day one that gets them off to a fairly decent start is to feed that broiler starter feed, that 21% protein, feed that for the first half of their life or development period. I'm sorry. So till about 8 weeks, and 8 weeks is a good first number if you're going to be doing this for the first time. So starter to 8 weeks. And then at 8 weeks, you can switch to a grower, which is down into that 18% range, and then feed that till they're right on the precipice of lay, which is going to be 16 and a half, 17 weeks. Then you can put them on a layer, which is 17%. That's a 3-phase layered feed from day old to point of lay. And we'll talk more about feed impact on your layers here in a few minutes and in a later tip. It's not the best way necessarily to feed your layers. There's more fine-tuned nuances, but we're assuming you're starting small, so that's the practical way to do it. If you're not buying ready-to-lay pullets, which I do recommend ready-to-lay pullets if you can source them. They're very, very hot commodity here in 2020, the spring of 2020. I'm sold out through September pretty much. And then the final feeding regimen here is turkeys. Turkeys cannot do well on a starter grower, turkeys cannot do well just by feeding them a broiler grower ration from day one. You will kill a lot of your turkeys. Either you'll see some leg problems, or you start to see at 7-10 days, you'll start to see turkeys just kind of dying one at a day. And usually it comes back to nutrition. So turkeys like to be started at 24 to 26% protein. 24 might be a little bit on the small side or the low side, depending on the ration and the formulation. The details of these formulations always matter. It's our human nature to think of them in a protein number, which is why you always see feeds referenced that way. But the details are really the important part, specifically like methionine levels and lysine levels and specific nutrients, the vitamins and minerals. Those are the details that matter in your feed formulation. They just usually get translated out into a crude protein number. So that's the shorthand that we reference them by. But the ins and outs of your actual feed composition is an advanced level podcast, and we'll do that at some other time. So turkeys in that 24 to 26 ration. So the question is, and the problem is really that most of us, unless you have an established small scale independent pastured turkey community around you, you're not going to find turkey starter feed in your area. I mean, I say you're not going to, but obviously some people do. I don't. Like, I went to buy turkey feed, starter feed from my organic guy last summer in July when my turkeys came, because I knew he supplied some other farms in the area, and he had one bag, and it was a leftover bag from a batch that he milled for the farm that I knew he mixed feed for. And I said, Bucky, what's going on, man? He's like, nobody buys turkey feed, so I don't make it except for one farm. And I'm like, holy smokes. So I was caught there. I didn't quite realize that, but nobody else has it. And that's a problem. So what happens if you just have a grower feed at, say, 19%? How can you make that a starter feed for turkeys? And one way is through the inclusion of fish meal. And if you don't like fish meal, you can find some other high protein source and use a Pearson square to balance the ration. Pearson square is a little bit beyond this show. If you're curious, look it up. And if I can work it in at some point, I'll do an episode on the Pearson square, because it's a really beneficial way to make some quick 2-ingredient rationing changes in the field. 2 ingredients here are a prepared feed and a protein source. So anyway, a fish meal, and this would be based on a Fertrell feeds, and this is why the Pearson square would get you dialed into whatever you're using. But say you have 20 pounds of 19% broiler starter or broiler grower, and you want to make it a 26% turkey starter protein, you can add 4 pounds of fish meal. So 4 pounds of fish meal to 20 pounds of feed equals a 26% protein starter. If you want to go from 19 to 21%, add 2 pounds of fish meal to your 20 pound of prepared ration, and you can see how that works. So I don't always have that level of fish meal on hand, because I can buy fish meal by the 60-pound sacks, I think it is, 50 or 60, and it's usually about $60. It's a little on the expensive side, and if I don't use it, it sits around. So one way that I've done my turkeys in the past is to use a broiler starter. So I can get a starter ration, which is a 21%, and then I top dress it with eggs. I just hard boil eggs, shell and all, crush them up and put them on top of the feed, and the turkeys absolutely love it. I'm not quite sure why this works. This is a trick I learned from Jonathan Coulimore out in Washington State. Because the protein of eggs is something like 12%. So there's not a high protein source, but I think the details here are in the amino acid profile of the eggs. That's my gut. I would love to be able to prove that out, and that might be a research trial for another day. But that has worked well for me when I did it. It's worked well for Jonathan for many, many years. And so just a couple ways to work on your turkey feeding. Okay, so now hopefully you have a place to buy it. You have the right kind of feed in mind for the chicken that you're raising. It's matched up as best as you can get it. Now you actually need to feed your birds. And so this comes down to tip number 5, which is provide enough feeder space. And the real quick numbers here, this isn't rocket science. When they're in the brooder, budget 1 inch of space, 1 inch of feeder space per chick. For the meat birds, as they hit that 7-8 week time frame when they're roly-poly and ready to be slaughtered, 3 inches per chick. For layers, the heritage birds, as they get mature and they get bigger and they're in production, 3 to 5 inches of linear feeder space per chick gives everybody a chance to eat at the same time, reduces your threat of feed competition, and there are people who can feed their birds with less feeder space than that. And as long as you know what you're doing and things are going well and your feeder doesn't run out, and you might be okay. You're probably okay, right? But one of the problems here with meat birds specifically and developing chicks is letting the feed run out. When you let the feed run out and you don't have enough feeder space, you cause feed competition when you do feed, and that usually results in injury, the most obvious thing. But then you turn around at some point in the raising of those chicks and you realize that you've stunted the growth of a third of your flock. They're inconsistent in their weights. You can follow that same feeding space for water, which brings us into tip number 6. Water drives feed consumption. Your water should be cool, shaded, and have adequate space. So I don't really honestly know a lot of people who have enough water space for all of their birds to eat or drink at the same time. What I do see, though, is people using one like Plisson waterer, hanging Plisson waterer for a flock of 100 birds. Probably not enough, right? That number should be closer to 4. And I guess the one guideline here is whatever commercial guideline you look at for giving water to the chickens, cut it in half. So if the waterer tells you it will support 50 birds, assume 25 in your pastured environment, because you want them to have enough water that they can drink when they need it, and that it's cool and shaded. Meat birds don't cross the sun to go drink. They'll die first. Layers are a little more hardy. They'll tolerate it. But when you take water away from your layers, it will impact their egg production, and taking water away means that sometimes it's too hot that they won't drink it, right? That's the same as it being frozen. When taking water away just means that the hens aren't drinking it for whatever reason, whether it's empty, frozen, or hotter than, whatever. Hotter than the chicken, which is 104 or 5 degrees, whatever that is. If your water is hotter than the chicken, she's not going to drink it. A chicken, as a rough guide here, will drink twice as much water as it eats feed by weight when it's 80 degrees. That's just a 2-to-1 ratio, right? And that's roughly at 80 degrees. So as you go hotter, you need more water. As you go colder, you need less water. Understanding and keeping an eye on your water consumption is always a good idea, because one of the first signals of your troubleshooting. Are they drinking? And it's one of the most important things that you can do. Jeff Maddox just did a webinar called Golden Rules of Pastured Poultry Production. 1 is air quality, 2 is water quality, 3 is feed quality. So a simple test here with your water: will you drink it? If you don't drink it, your chickens won't drink it. It's pretty simple. So make sure the water is drinkable by you, then your chickens will have what they need. And that includes being cool and clean. So number 7 on Mike's list of things that you should know about are supplements. I'm going to talk about 2 supplements here: grit and oyster shell. So grit is a hard granite rock that is of various sizes based on the life stage of the bird you're working with. And in the East Coast, you typically have a granite grit, which is white bag, comes out of North Carolina, maybe some other mine in the South. Then as you work further west in the country, there's some stuff called cherry stone. It's a red in size, but it's the same thing. It's not the same thing. It's the same idea. It's hard rock that the chicken eats along with its feed that sits in its gizzard. And the gizzard is a muscle that contracts and squeezes the grit into the feed that it's eating, and it pulverizes it so that it absorbs the nutrients better. And that's the first good thing it does, right? It helps the chicken utilize that feed by breaking it down. And if you're raising birds on pasture, you need grit more than ever, because they're going to be eating fibrous material that they can't break down otherwise. So putting them on pasture without grit is really kind of a torturous way to raise your bird, because their biology is not, you're giving them something that they're going to eat, but you don't give them a way to eat it, because your chickens don't have teeth. You might have heard that before. It's true. Stick your head in there and look. Their tooth, the way that they grind that feed and break it down is in the gizzard using grit, using rocks. They're not going to get the grit, the rocks they need on your pasture. Maybe if you have like 4 hens and a rooster named Buddy, they will by grazing your driveway. But assuming you're going to be doing any kind of numbers, or you're going to actually be using some kind of rotational model in your pastured poultry, you need to give them grit. All of them, all your birds need grit. The other supplement you have applies really to layers only, and that's oyster shell. Oyster shell is a calcium source. It's supplemental, so you just offer that free choice along with the free choice grit, and they will eat it when they need it. And basically the thing to know about here is when your layer lays an egg, she has extra calcium in the diet that you're giving her, but part of the calcium for the egg comes out of her bones. So she needs to replenish that, and the feed is not necessarily going to give her everything that she needs. So giving her the extra calcium resource helps her replenish those stocks. It's a slower releasing calcium because it's a big chunk. So it slowly dissolves in the in the digestive tract. So oyster shell for your layers, grit for every chicken you have, shot by size. The bags tell you what size they are. At least the granite grit does. I'm pretty not sure about the cherry stone stuff. I'm assuming it does. Okay, makes some sense. So that was supplements for chickens. Number 8 here, we're rolling into the end. Got a couple more to go, but this is kind of some practical perceptions for your feed. And this is kind of where maybe some of the more experienced folks will plug in and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? Because they've got some of the feed sourcing and ideas ahead of all lined up. But what are the influences? What influences does feed have on your lay rate, for example, or your feed conversion, for example? So we'll look at 2 very succinct examples because they play out like clockwork every season. Let's look at layers first. There's 2 scenarios, right? We're in spring now as I record this, so we're going to head into the heat of the summer, and some locations are already in the heat of the spring, right? The South is already burning hot. And what happens with a laying hen, or any chicken really, is that chicken eats for energy needs. So a chicken ration, a turkey ration, a poultry ration is formulated based on the energy needs and the protein needs of the chicken to live. And so when it's hot, your chicken eats less feed because it needs less energy. So the problem then is the chicken is getting less protein, and the chicken gets less protein. She lays less eggs. Her production drops because you need a certain amount of protein to make an egg. And if the hen doesn't eat the right amount of protein, she doesn't lay an egg. It's pretty simple. Eat protein, lay a protein. So one of the tricks that has become more and more commonplace is folks who are running market flocks of size and who have custom rations actually reformulate their feeds as they go through the hot period of the summer to be high protein, low energy, so that when the hen is eating that light amount of feed, that small amount of feed, she still gets enough protein to lay an egg and keep her egg production up. So some layer rations for mature layers on pasture in the summer could be like 21% or more, 22%, 20%, something like that, where, other layer rations might typically be 16 or 17%. So it's quite a bit higher, and it's that way for a purpose. Now, the same thing works in the wintertime, except you have the opposite problem. In the wintertime, in the cold climates, the hen is eating for energy still. So she needs more energy in the cold. So she eats more feed when it's cold outside, which means she gets the energy she needs, but she also gets an excess of protein. And when that excess of protein ends up turning into jumbo eggs. So next thing you know, you're walking outside and you're no longer getting large. You're not even getting extra large. You're getting jumbo and jumbo plus and jumbo plus plus. And, these are the things that all the backyard folks post on Facebook, right? And all the groups you're a part of. It's like, oh, look at my cute jumbo egg. Like I can fit my head inside of it. Well, it's probably painful for the layer to lay such a monstrosity. You're going to get less eggs out of it, but that's a clear sign that your feed is off, right? I mean, jumbo eggs, big eggs are also a reflection of the age of the hen, but you control a lot of that by feed. And that's why some of the larger flocks who are running 1,000 or a couple thousand or 10,000 layers can actually phase feed their layers and adjust their ration based on how many large and extra large eggs they get. Not the topic for this podcast, but just know that's kind of that's the next level. That's possible. But it all comes down to recognizing that the egg size you see, or even the lack of egg, can come back to the amount of protein it's eating. So in the summertime, when you go into the heat and you're not adjusting your ration because you don't have any choice or you didn't know about it, your production may drop. You may go from 80% lay down to 60, or in the or whatever. So I'm just making those numbers up to illustrate the point, but it's common. It's not unusual. And then in the wintertime, of course, the other direction is you end up taking jumbo and extra jumbo size eggs because she's eating too much protein. And the wintertime is easier to deal with because you just go buy some scratch grain, which is like one of the only times I advocate for scratch, and just toss a handful out per 10 or 12 hens. And or put it in their feeder, or get some cracked corn or something and put it in their feeder. And if you want to be precise, you can use the Pearson square to balance that. We're typically not too precise. We just toss some in there. And by eating the corn, which is energy, they'll eat less of their high protein feed and kind of balances it a little bit on the go and manages your egg size back to a size that you can close the carton with. And so when it comes to broilers, then one of the things that's harder for me to quantify, and I've seen this reported time and time again in the APA community, is the impact of old feed. And people report that when they go from buying feed every 2 weeks or every 30 days down to mixing and milling their own feed on farm every week, they see an increase in feed conversion. So the correlation there is fresh feed always has a better feed conversion. Always, I shouldn't say always, but the likelihood is fresh feed has a better effect on your chicken than feed that's weeks or months old. Definitely months old, because one of the challenges, and I encourage you not to stockpile feed. I talked about this in one of the COVID episode when I was telling you not to stockpile feed because it would maim your chickens later, is when you mill feed and you crack the grains and you manufacture it, the feed, the mineral and the vitamin content, specifically the vitamin content, in this case B is where I want to talk about, starts to oxidize out. And so it's one of the first vitamins to go out of your feed. And when you start getting feed that's been milled longer than 30 days ago, those levels are probably getting pretty low. And you start seeing curly toe. These are the toe deformities of your chickens. So usually a clear sign that you have old feed. So a real quick word math problem here that illustrates the importance of feed conversion, which is something you want to pay attention to. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. When you're buying cheap feed, you never quite know what value your cheap feed saves you or costs you until you run it through your chickens. So run the feed through your chickens, then you have a point to base your future buying habits on and your needs assessment. So broiler chickens live and die by feed conversion ratio. That's kind of the golden number. And if we operate on the assumption that a chicken has a potential of 3-to-1 feed conversion, or that's a good number, right? That's a good benchmark to hit for a Cornish cross. It's not great. It's just good. It's okay. And let's say your production is coming out to 4-to-1 and you're feeding an organic feed at 50 cents a pound. Your feed cost then for a 4-pound chicken is $8. And if I'm running through the numbers quickly, I walk through feed conversion in the episode 105 and provided a worksheet that walked you through feed conversion. So I'm not going to dwell on the details here. It's something we've covered quite a bit on this podcast. So either back up 15 seconds or 30 seconds to this point and listen again, or go to 105, grab the worksheet and actually see it in print. So feed conversion at 4-to-1 is going to take $8 in feed to get a 4-pound chicken using organic feed at 50 cents a pound. So ask yourself, what happens when you go to 3-to-1, right? You improve your feed conversion from 4-to-1 to 3-to-1. So that means you got less feed to get the same amount of meat. So your feed cost then will drop $25 or 25%. Your feed cost drops 25% to $6 a chicken. So if you're raising like 4 chickens, $2 a bird, who cares, right? You probably, you're so inefficient at that point, it doesn't really matter. Maybe it does. I don't know. But you get the point, right? With 4 chickens, $2 a bird in feed, probably not going to be a radical decision. You're probably not going to think about it. But what happens if you have 100 birds? Now you have a $200 in savings. You've just added $200 to your margin by making that 25% improvement. And for every 1,000 birds, now you're saving $2,000. So that's the power of scaling up your chickens and this power of small numbers in chickens is it scales. So that's why you care about feed conversion. That's why you care about finding the best feed that actually converts. And just shopping on price, you don't know that, and you don't have that comparison if price is your only benchmark. So number 9 here, we're going to finish up with number 9. saved my best for last. Some tips for feeding the Cornish cross. Now, if you haven't heard this rumor, well, I'm not going to give you the rumor. I'm going to tell you how you should feed a Cornish cross. When I feed meat birds, Cornish cross, Freedom Ranger, whatever they are, I don't care. I want feed in front of that chicken all the time. Like, I don't want the chicken to ever go to the feeder and be empty. And a couple reasons for that. Obviously, the longer you have to feed the chicken, the more labor you have. So there's a labor cost to deal with. The other part of that is the longer you keep a meat bird on your farm, the more at risk it is for predation and the more at risk it is for a health issue. So those are three negatives of prolonging the growth of any meat bird beyond what it needs to be. And when you withhold feed by not giving it feed all the time, then you're going to slow down that growth and you're going to incur those risks. Now, and the other mistake, and this is an honest mistake that people make, is I talked earlier about the feeder space, having enough feeder space for all birds to eat. That's the golden rule, right? Forget all the numbers. If all your chickens can eat at the same time, you have enough feeder space. If all your chickens can't eat at the same time, you don't have enough feeder space. That's your evaluation. That's how you know if you're doing it right. So normalize all your observations to, can all my chickens eat at the same time? What happens is if you let the feed run out, especially with meat birds and very especially with Cornish cross, is you let the feed run out, you come in to feed then at some point, and the chickens are like, oh, Mike's here. It's dinner time. I'm hungry. They're going to crowd the feeder to eat. They're all going to rush that feeder. And if they can't all eat at the same time, they're going to step on each other, scratch each other, and ravage each other and push each other out of the way so they can get to the feeder to eat. And what happens is chickens will be injured because of that, and you'll have uneven growth because of that. Two very, very bad situations, all because you were trying to follow internet wisdom that said you shouldn't keep feed in front of your chickens all the time. If you feed appropriate feed for your Cornish cross and you process them on time, which is 7 or 8 weeks, every time you go past 8 weeks, you're pushing the envelope if you don't know what you're doing, right? You need to reevaluate feed if you're going to go for a roaster size, 8, 9, heaven forbid, 10 weeks. And you need experience to figure out how you're going to do that. Because it is true that Cornish cross do grow rapidly. It is true that if they grow too rapidly with the wrong feed and the wrong management, they will have health problems. They will have difficulty walking. They will look like a football with sticks sticking out of the bottom of them. And, that's just the way it is. So if you know that going in, make an effort to feed them appropriately and process on time, and you eliminate 99%. Like every time, if you do have Cornish cross problems, the 19% starter grower ration is the best way to go. I don't know that I've ever had a leg problem when I've followed that feeding regimen, or even a cities or anything like that. It is one of the best feeding programs that there is if you're not sure of what you're doing. Now, one of the challenges here with people who feed Cornish cross is you're going into stores and you're buying a national brand feed, or you're buying some kind of commercial. And by commercial, I basically mean the feed you commonly get through the retail channels at the big feed stores, the big box feed stores. The challenge with those feeds usually is, and even to be honest, some of the other larger commercial brands you might find, is they use a recycled oil. Sometimes it's fryer oil that's been reprocessed. So that's a low quality fat to begin with. It's really not something I think about feeding to my chickens. I really want to feed to my chicken, but that's the reality of a lot of that commercial least cost rationed feed, in addition to being stuffed full of byproducts with no nutritional value like wheat midds or bakery byproducts. That's two examples. And so those feed ingredients, those low quality feed ingredients, are not going to help you when you feed your Cornish cross. If that's the feed you have, then yeah, you might want to make sure you have enough feeder space, and then limit that feed out a little bit and just don't give them a few hours a day where they don't eat feed. But if you have a balanced feed that's made for pastured poultry folks, from a feed mill that knows about pastured poultry and is sourcing and making quality feed versus cheap feed, then lay the feed to those things and let them go. And ignore everybody else that says it can't be done. It can be done. It's done by millions of chickens every year by pastured poultry folks. But I always come back to this idea that the commercial meat birds, those little white meatballs, things we would call Cornish cross, genetics by the industry, they're what all of America is used to eating. And quite honestly, more and more of the world. When I was in Cameroon, these guys were raising Cobb 500s. They all had the Cobb 500 management guides. They weren't following them worth a hoot because they're in Cameroon and access to different things was feed was hard. And sometimes they made decisions about who ate, the chickens or the family, and their environments were not, environmentally controlled. So there's wild environments, more so even than what you might find in a pastured poultry environment. And so the world, these things have infiltrated the world. They're everywhere. And they're what a lot of people are used to eating. And what I want to say is when you take the Cobb 500, the Ross 708, the Hubbard, whatever it is, and you take that bird out of a CAFO and you put it into a pastured environment and you feed it appropriately, you feed it correctly, and you process it on time, it's going to be a different bird. It's going to be healthy. It will even run when it's younger and kind of jog when it gets a little older, and it will move and it will do all those things that a chicken should do, and it will scratch and it will peck. And part of that is you getting the bird out there on pasture at a reasonable time. Like every day past 3 weeks of age that you wait to get a Cornish cross out on pasture, the slower and the harder it is for that chicken to acclimate to the pasture, like in terms of foraging and instinctual behavior. Like the sooner you can get it there, the better off it will be, as long as it's feathered out and ready to go and the climate's right. Enough of the Cornish cross. I'm not a Cornish cross lover. I do have a batch that I'm processing at the moment. I do like some of the other birds more, but it's hard to match the performance, the familiarity, and the reliability of a Cornish cross. And if you're having problems raising them, the problem most squarely sits with you and what you're feeding. So maybe not you personally, but what you're doing. And it starts with feed a lot of times, and the quality of the feed that you're giving them. Cheap is not the answer. It's almost never the answer. The Cornish cross are high performance birds. They need to be fed a feed that matches their performance, and with a manager that takes their performance into account and just doesn't sling a 26% protein at it for 9 weeks and wonder why it flips over with heart attacks a day before processing. I guess that's all we got here. Maybe I got time for a bonus tip. I'm getting a little long. I'll be right about an hour, it looks like, in this conversation. And I'll just plant the idea of a future conversation. And if you're an APA member, you're going to see some of this content pop up in the APA grit. And that's mycotoxins. Here's what I want you to observe for this introductory podcast. This is what I want you to observe. When you have feed waste in your feeder, and we'll talk about adjusting feeders as we look at the brooder in the next section and talk about managing the brooder space. When you look at your feed consumption by your birds, and if you see a lot of feed picked out and flung around the feeder, look and see what it is. Right? Are they picking out corn? Is that the waste? If they're sorting feed and throwing corn out of their feeder, you have an opportunity to check that feed. There's something wrong, and you need to figure out what it is, because chickens shouldn't pick out feed. Their corn specifically. Like, they love corn. It's like crack. That's why you shouldn't give them scratch grains every day of their life. They'll get fat because they love it. So just don't feed the cracked corn. I did a flock walk here with one of my pullet customers in the winter, and I noticed a bunch of corn just flung out of the feeders. And so I picked up a kernel of corn and I held it in the palm of my hand and I gave it to a hen. She looked at my hand, she saw the corn, she pecked it, she turned her head and spit it out. That's about as obscene as it gets in chicken land, right? That is like a no-go. Chickens don't do that. That feed tested hot for some mycotoxins. We only tested vomitoxins that had it. I'm guessing there was a lot more to it than that. Same thing with soybean. If you have like roasted soybean in there, make sure that the feed, the hens, if they're sorting the soybean out, there's probably something wrong with the soybean, and that might be roasting if it's whole bean or something. But be in tune with that. If feed sorting could be an indication of mycotoxins or some other issues with the feed. So be observant, watch what's happening when they eat. And we'll talk about how to feed when we go into the brooder, which is next. We'll start putting these birds on the ground. Those episodes will be a little bit quicker and more action oriented. This is just some of the stuff you need to know. The feeding is some of the stuff you need to know, the foundation stuff, and it's the decisions you make before you ever get birds in the first place. So that's the reason we're walking through this. And you realize that as you listen, you may have birds already, you may be buying feed already. But my wish is you just calibrate what you're doing with the information I'm distilling from you, which really is distilled from, like I said, my experience, my education, which doesn't always match what I do. So there's a theoretical that works. There's a whatever I do that may or may not work. And then there's what the APA community has done, and they all come into the pipeline to share with you. And if you do these things that I've talked about today on this episode, then I think you're setting yourself up for a good feed experience, which, don't buy cheap feed. Understand what Pasture's role is in your production. It's not a feed source. Stop thinking of it like that. Source known good quality feed from a local mill, as local as possible. Understand the nutritional needs of your layers, broilers, and turkeys, and feed them appropriately. Provide enough feeder space. Don't skimp on water. Water drives feed consumption. All chickens need grit. Your layers need oyster shell as a supplement. And the protein in your layer feed affects productivity and egg size. Fresh feed is always better. Cornish cross can eat feed 24/7. Actually, they don't eat during the dark time, but they can have unlimited, unrestricted access to feed and still be healthy. Trust me on that. And look out for feed sorting and note that behavior when you see it, because it could indicate that you have a problem with mycotoxins that we need to evaluate and get tested further. Folks, that's a lot. If you want the cheat sheet for the nutritional guidelines, go ahead and check out pasturepoultrytalk.com/106. Until next time, this is Mike. I thank you for your ears. We'll be back with some tips in the brooder. I'm going to try to get that out here relatively quickly. We'll see what happens. Thanks, y'all.